Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Climate Conundrum podcast. Today, we're diving into the world of food and its intricate dance with climate change. I want all of us to take a pause here and just quickly think about your favorite food. It can be anything in the whole wide world, right? I want us to do this because when we take that moment and think about what you love the most in the world, what you would choose over and over again to eat, um, one question and one realization pops up is how much there has to the work has to be done to kind of bring that plate to you. So today, that's the topic I'm going to delve in. And I have someone really special. She's my senior from my master's program, but also we've worked together on a few projects, and one of my most favorite persons to work with, Dr. Radhika Mittal. I'm going to let her introduce herself because it's a very interesting field and a lot of interesting projects that she does. So yeah, over to you, Radhika.
Thanks, Sanika. Thanks also for this lovely introduction. Indeed, it's always a pleasure to work with you, and I'm glad that you thought of me for this podcast. Well, I'm actually a communication scientist or a media and narrative specialist in the field of sustainability and climate change. Food has been at the heart of my research for some time now. When I first started looking at climate change narratives, it struck me that no one is looking at the way we represent food in the media or the way we talk about food. So the journey with food really started to examine media narratives. And because it's such a fascinating topic, I started going into looking at the health impacts, looking at environmental impacts. I mean, environmental impacts was absolutely necessary for my literature review anyway. So that definitely that's there. And it changed my life. It changed the way I eat and live, researching food and climate change. And I did a PhD at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, looking at climate-friendly food practices and their mediated narratives in Australia and the US. I've had different career paths, but then I basically also looked at food choices through a research position at the University of Hamburg in Germany, examining sustainable lives and food choices as practice. So that's my association with food. Yeah, I'd love to be able to respond to any questions that you might have. But of course, food is a touchy topic. It's not just about the environment. It's also cultural. It's also emotional. We have a lot of things when we think about food. We think about health and so on. So it's a very intersectional kind of topic. But it's also one of the most important topics when we talk about climate change. It is definitely, and we're waking up to the fact that food is a very big contributor. The way we produce and consume food is a very big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah.
Thank
So
you, Radhika. This was already a great start. In the introduction itself, there's so much power that is packed that I'm eager to delve into more details. But you're so right. Food is a touchy topic, right? It is something that we all have a very, very intimate connection with. And if someone comes up and tells you that your choices are wrong or sudden changes have to be made, whether by choice or because nature just has stopped producing it, then you realize how different the world becomes without that. So yeah, on the continuing on that same thing that I asked everyone to do about thinking of their favorite food. Um, when I did this homework before we started recording, um, I realized the implications of right from growing, harvesting, processing, packaging, transporting, to then eating it. There's so many levels involved in bringing that plate of food to you.
and we're
And
blind to it. We don't see it, we don't know it. We only see the finished product in front of us. So
exactly.
this is the disconnect or the blind spot. Yeah.
And I think I want to start there today. When when I read some reports that talk about how roughly about a quarter of all man-made greenhouse gas emissions come from food systems and agriculture and even the transportation and distribution of food, then you quickly realize that this is an absolutely essential topic to tackle. Not just that, but at an individual level, the awareness needs to grow on how we eat, how we consume, what we consume, and where are we doing all of this, because that matters as well. So, keeping an Indian context in mind, right, today, I think I'd like to just keep that focus, because there's so much literature out there and there's a lot of critique on Western food habits and consumption patterns, but I haven't come across too much science-based, evidence-based ideas when it comes to Indian food habits. So I think my first question is going to be, what is your favorite food? And do you know what impact it leads to?
Well, favorite is difficult because you could like all kinds of food, right? I think my comfort food would be something very basic, like khichdi,
Mhm.
right? A combination of lentils and rice, or even a millet khichdi, which is a combination of lentils and millets,
Mm,
or aloo paratha. And since we're talking in the Indian context, we know that. But if we, for viewers in Europe and so on, it's a potato flatbread stuffed with potato and spices. So I think these are very naturally low emission foods.
mm,
You don't really, the carbon footprint for, say, a kilogram of lentils would be barely 0.9 kgs of emissions, of carbon dioxide emissions. And this is including everything from production to transportation and so on, right? And of course, I don't have the emissions of every food on my fingertips, but in reality, lentils and legumes, they're some of the lowest carbon emission foods. So anything you make with them are pretty much low carbon emissions.
mm.
Also, orchard fruits, like now mangoes in India are in season, and why?
Yeah.
Because orchards also sequester carbon back into the atmosphere, into the land. So
Oh, it
those,
is. Okay.
yes, so trees do that, right? And so anything, if you've planted an orchard, you've planted hundreds and thousands of trees, they're not only giving you fruit, which is great for you physically, mentally, emotionally, and just the joy of eating fruit, right? But also they sequester carbon. And legumes do that. Lentils also fix nitrogen in the soil. So when we're thinking about food, of course, we're not thinking about this, but if you think about the kind of food you like to eat, like I would, on a bad day or a rainy day or a cold day, you just want a nice warm bowl of khichdi, and it may not be your top favorite food, but it's a food that would come to mind when you feel like you really need something nourishing. So that's why. Yeah.
Absolutely. We sync on this because I literally did that same task of figuring out my favorite or comfort food, and I came up with khichdi. Um, there is a website I found which is not accurate. I mean, I'm not going to say it's reliable to the T, but it gives you an approximation to figure out the carbon footprint of it.
Mm.
So if I typed about 100 grams of rice, 100 grams of
Yeah.
lentils, and I even added ghee just to
Yeah.
be on the safer side, it shows up that I have a emission value of 322 grams of CO2 per serving,
Yeah.
which they also gave me an additional detail saying that that is the equivalent of eating 4.5 apples or two slices of a pizza
Wow.
or
Yeah.
0.1% of a beef burger.
Precisely.
Yeah, so then this is again the same um, thing that we keep hearing, right? How vegetarian diets are extremely climate friendly, and we need to do more of that.
Definitely. 1 kg of beef is about 27 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions. So that's already gone way beyond what you've had in just a bowl, of lentils and rice, for example.
So while this is told
Mm.
to all of us, I think it's a little harder to understand when we tend to use numbers. So I'm
Mm.
going to ask you something which always bothers me, right? And I think a lot of people might benefit from it. So how do people make these calculations, and where does these numbers come from?
Okay, Yeah, I mean the calculations, if you pick up any data site, right, you will see calculations include not only yeah, you include land use, right? How do you use the land? How does it change? So for example, also the amount of deforestation involved, which is true for most animal products. You've cut trees and forests to grow that. It includes farming practices, right? So emissions from fertilizers, from machinery, manure, and all of that. Also, you would have, the processing. So, for example, and I'm going to livestock now. You also have, processing for feed. So you process crop into feed for livestock, for example, right? And then finally, there's more processing when we convert agricultural products into the final food items, right? And so therefore, whenever we have more processed food, it's obviously taking up more emissions because it's been made into something that's not its original form, right?
Mm,
So that's why I always like to say when you ask if you ask what are the lowest, most climate friendly foods, the
mm,
foods that are in their natural unprocessed form, most of them, and a lot of them are typically plant-based. You would have nuts, you would have fruit, you would have vegetables of all kinds, root vegetables, again, legumes, some cereals like corn, wheat, rye, all of this, right? And then the minute you go into processing, it's then you're putting it, of course, and then there's packaging. So there's processing, there's packaging, there's
right.
transport. And whenever you're transporting anything that requires cold, extreme cold refrigeration, takes up more emissions. And there's a retailing, because then you're in a supermarket. So you need electricity, energy, everything to keep those things in those aisles in pristine condition,
Mm,
right? So no wonder that we say, go try to shop at your local grocer, pick up food from the farmer's market, encourage farmers. So all of that, because then you're not, yeah. So there's a lot, right? There's a lot that goes into it. If you're going from farm to fork, it's a very big cycle.
there's
And
rarely a farm to fork, is what I hear actually. Most of it goes through a lot of phases of
yeah.
all the things that you just explained. So, then what does a climate conscious diet look like, according to you?
Yeah, well, then a climate conscious diet would be the one, as I said, one food in its most natural form, right? Food that you can have as a staple diet, which is largely unprocessed and raw. So, and this is very useful from the perspective of thinking of India's culinary tradition because that is how we eat. We grow and, typically in an idyllic Indian village, you're also growing, there are farms and then you're plucking fresh food out of the farm. So you're eliminating a lot of those steps and, just cleaning up that food and cooking it and eating it. So there's really, you've shortened, look at the cycle. It's from 6 to 7 steps, you've gone down to maybe 2 or 3 steps. So that makes a difference. But really the ideal diet would, I would say would be plant-based to a large extent because plant-based food, again, has about 10 to 50 times lower emissions than most animal-based foods, right?
Oh,
So this
wow.
makes this makes a very big difference. It's a huge shift that anyone can make with traditions like India, where vegetarian diets are the norm, right? That's really helpful. Now we face another issue with milk because dairy is also actually a product of animal agriculture in so many
Yeah.
ways. Therefore, that gives you a bit of a higher carbon footprint. I think it can be managed in some ways, but then I would go to say local. So plant-based and local. Actually, local food, so transport emissions are not the biggest factor in greenhouse gas emissions when it comes to food. The production emissions are. So, again, animal-based products emitting methane and dangerous, harmful gases, that's the real issue. Transport is not such a big issue. So if you're eating locally produced meat versus meat that is flown across the world for you, that you're still emitting a lot.
I
But
see. Okay,
right,
that's an interesting
that's
observation. Yes.
yes. But if you're eating plant-based and you're striving to eat local, seasonal, I mean, really, you're doing the very best and organic.
Mm.
Okay, organic is expensive, but if you're trying to grow food, for example, or if you're supporting local organic farmers with maybe not such a big price difference in price point, okay, that you're doing really a lot through that. Yeah.
So some of my younger friends and I usually have, I'm not very popular on the dining table, especially when I see people eat avocados.
Right.
And that's for an obvious reason, because I cannot help but not make fun of the fact that you're saying that you're going vegan or sustainable,
Yeah.
but opting for an avocado that was flown thousands of miles for you from, say,
Yeah.
Brazil or somewhere else, that really just contradicts the whole point of the choices you're making.
Yeah.
But not to be that person. I actually just want to raise that issue because nowadays there are a lot of food trends that come up
Yeah.
regarding environmentally friendly choices.
Yeah.
And in that, another contested topic usually becomes about veganism.
Yeah.
Um, because as Indians, we are used to seeing milk products, milk
Mhm.
um, as vegetarian food.
Yeah.
Um, so I wanna actually hear from you about this subtle difference between vegetarianism, veganism, and
Yeah.
how sort of these choices impact climate um, adaptation as well as, I guess, impacts.
Yeah. So on the point of avocados, do you know that there are avocados grown in Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Kerala? So for those vegan friends who really want their avocados, there is a local option. They should not and do not have to fly avocados all the way from Mexico. Also because then, yeah, there are many other intersectional issues there about farmers and their crops and cash crops and so on. But we could have avocados as a treat if we have a locally grown avocados, which are simply, suppose, flown from somewhere in Karnataka to a few parts in India. Uh, but the subtle differences, so of course, so that's again more something to be more conscious about, which is
Mhm.
sometimes difficult. But I do know people in Delhi, for example, who do go to this big mandi, the big vegetable market, and they do know growers who have sourced their avocados from Karnataka, and which is great. Then you're
Yeah.
really also, if you want to fulfill that need for a nutritious fruit, maybe occasionally or whatever. So this works.
Mm.
Uh, Vegetarianism in its very pure form, where and I use that word very loosely, but in a space where there is a symbiotic relationship between nature, animals, and humans, is
Mm.
entirely possible and a great diet. Vegetarianism, when milk is, when your country becomes a dominant producer and consumer of milk and is actually contributing to beef, because basically what happens to all the cows, right? I don't remember the year, but at one point, India was the largest exporter of beef.
It
I
was
think
right up until it was banned in India. Yeah.
exactly. So at that point, even overtaking a country like Brazil, and the reason is because milk becomes liquid meat
Mm.
because we have these cows and we've made it an industry. So if someone can have a farmhouse and have their cows and their buffaloes, and really in India they were part of the family. They were part of your farm process, of course, but they were also regarded as, and that's why we always attributed, sacred context to nature in India, because that helps to build a certain relationship. It's symbolic,
Mm.
right? But then if you have your own cows, and if they are producing a little bit of milk, and when the calf has been well fed, and the remaining milk that's left over, it won't be a lot. It will be a little. It will be enough to make a little bit of clarified butter or ghee, right, for topping your khichdi with or so on.
Mm.
But it's not going to be to the extent that we are now consuming milk products. And
Right.
I think the difference is about the quantity, the amount, and also thinking about what it does to our health. So yeah, so the subtle differences are India is naturally vegan. We naturally have so many foods that are vegan. What we've seen in the recent years is an uptake in dairy products. And this is really a very American diet. It's
Mm.
really a very Western construct of how we should consume dairy. And I'll give you a tiny example. When I was a child in school or in college, uh, whatever biscuits you got, glucose biscuits, Britannia, whatever, they were simply wheat and some sugar or glucose or whatever, not super healthy, but they were biscuits.
Yeah.
And today I see in these biscuits, there's milk solids. I have to wonder, why do
Uh-huh.
we have such a big byproduct of dairy products that we have to put it in almost every food?
Mm.
We don't need this from a climate perspective. We don't need it from a health perspective because India
Or
is
an
also,
economic perspective
or
either.
an economic perspective. We're the
Yeah.
leader in type 2 diabetes, right? So yeah.
Yeah. Honestly, a lot of discussions related to climate usually boil down to the fact that industrialization
Hmm.
is is the root cause of most evil. And that's the exact thing I'm hearing right now as well. The moment the meat industry or the milk industry becomes a big enough factor that it stops being domestic, then it becomes an issue. A lot of people do argue on this one point, saying that actually the milk industry in India comes from domestically sourced milk, so it's not that bad. I wonder if you have any perspective on this, where smallholder farmers bring their milk and then that is added into the bigger chunk of, say, an Amul or a cooperative.
Yeah. I wouldn't have direct expertise in this, but I do know that if we are feeding cows, dairy animals, antibiotics, pumping hormones into them, it cannot be good. So the smallholder farmer is a dream, is a pipe dream, because we have, I mean, and that's not a topic that we can, I think, really go deeply into here, but there are huge inequities in the farming space. And actually farmers are uh, independent farmers are not in a good space, right? Do have rampant corporatization and industrialization. And I don't think the dairy industry, it's an industry. So when it's
Mhm.
an industry, the aim is to maximize profit and to produce as much as possible. And I think with something as sensitive as food, that's complicated. For example, India is one of the largest producers of lentils, but its domestic market is so big that it's not one of the largest exporters. And I think that's good in some ways because, you are eating your own produce. It's there, it's domestic, it's here, it is within the system, it is within a corporate industrialized setup. Of course, we need that. But when that's done with something like dairy, what happens to the animals, to the other byproducts? It's much more complicated. So, yeah, so I think unless you're living on your own farm, I wouldn't be.
Mm.
That's, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think summing up what you've just mentioned are some important points, right? Industrialization cannot be good for any industry. As cliched as the statement is, this is, it boils down to whether you're eating local, whether you're eating something that is in your local ecosystem, and can you make some conscious choices that are in moderation? Um, Maybe that could help uh,
Yeah.
create a healthy balance.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say industrialization per se is, bad or negative, because then it creates a very difficult barrier for us to overcome because we do live in an industrialized society. And
Right.
that's fine. We do, we have to work with what we have. And of course, I don't have all the answers, but we can't suddenly do away with a system that's right now functioning. We have to find ways to either reinvent it in parts and also replace it in parts. So,
Absolutely.
we need regenerative agriculture. We need also support of maybe some technologies. We need to rethink the way we are growing our food, the kind of food we're growing. We need to rethink the way we are making dietary practices. Which dietary practices are we making popular? How are we evolving culturally in the context of food? So there is a lot that can be done also from a policy perspective. But yeah, how can we keep industrialization or so-called economic growth and progress while not necessarily harming the lowest common denominator? You know,
Absolutely.
yeah,
And when we speak about the lowest common denominator, usually the question becomes, can these food practices that are sustainable, say like eating organic, or having certain food choices versus the others, are they actually scalable to all of us?
Mm.
especially in India, when we talk about a society which is so unequal, along with um, the reality that people still die of hunger.
Yeah.
Um, how do we approach this? Because this is such we can't have a discussion without keeping the other side in
Yeah.
on the table as well, so to say.
Yeah, I think we could do a lot. We vote with our pockets, literally. You vote with your money and you vote with your actions. And large scale behavior shifts are possible in terms of, um, uh, yeah, I mean, policy shifts are needed, but also behavioral shifts are needed. So the best thing that people could do when they are, wanting to say eat better or eat organic, they could eat regional, eat seasonal, support the local farmers, grow your own food, even if it's in a pot, even if it's on your balcony, just growing tomatoes. So that rekindling the connect with terroir, with the soil and with the idea of understanding what it takes is very important. And the more we support local farmers around us, I think it takes a little bit more effort for sure. But, I think that trend is growing. I know that
Yes,
in places in Mumbai, in places in Delhi, they do have farmers markets and people come to, we just need more of that. And communities could organize that. That's also not something that you need the government to do, for example, right? Buy less processed food, less packaged food. So again, I grew up in a time where I would just in Pune walk out to, pick up sabzi from anywhere. Just pick up your veggies from the person sitting on the corner,
yeah.
rather than to say a supermarket and buying a packaged vegetables, packaged peas or whatever. So now these are the smaller things. We don't have to, what we have to do is not make the shift uh, to the convenience, the idea of
Mm,
convenience, so quick to adopt, and that's, yeah, we could avoid waste. That's a very big thing. I mean, it's one of the three things that the Eat Lancet report talked about, also plant-based, but
right.
also, right? We could buy in bulk, go and buy, yeah, grains and lentils and things in bulk from local growers.
Hmm.
Uh, we could get our own wheat or atta, whatever kind of grain, in a chakki, going to a
Yeah.
mill and getting it ground there. So there are some very basic essential things that we could do ourselves, and it leads to a much healthier lifestyle, but it also leads to a more connected lifestyle. And then of course you participate. So, simple things, and this is not about food, but every time we go to a function, there's plastic water bottles, we could just bring our,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and just using those. And the policy option would be by default not to provide those. So making like plant-based food the default in functions and gatherings and, official arrangements at least. We
Mm.
could think about how we do our weddings. And so, for example, there's stuff that,
We are inherently sustainable as Indians, in our cultural as well as lifestyle choices. And I
yeah,
think the awareness, like you mentioned, we are somewhere going back to those choices, at least in urban areas, people are aware and a little movement has started. I do notice it.
mm,
But like you said, there has to be more effort on a community level. We
yeah,
can actually
yeah,
demand and opt for community solutions that
yeah.
help these choices.
And we have to be respectful. You mentioned, so I think militancy in anything is not useful, whether it's about a food practice, a food habit, or saying, I do this, but you do not. It only alienates people.
Mm,
So the way to bring about shifts is to organize, so also, I mean, I turned vegan 15 years back,
mhm.
but I remember that my goal was always to say, well, I'll cook something and bring it, rather than saying you should or should not eat this, because that's not going to work.
Yes,
People have to buy into your idea through, like to say, the way to man's what heart is through his stomach. I think the way to anyone's heart is through their stomach.
yes. I think it's genderless.
Less, of course.
This is such an important and sensitive topic you just mentioned. As you went vegan, but there is no force on anyone else to do the same. Everyone can make their own choices. Um, Usually, this becomes a pain point on any discussion related to food and climate.
Mhm.
when people start insisting that, oh, well, you're not going to get the protein intake. This is the usual argument that people hear. Um, you're not going to get the protein intake from being vegan or vegetarian compared
Yeah,
to having a meat-based diet. Um, what is the answer to this?
there's protein in everything.
Hmm.
There's protein in every cell, and anything you eat will have protein. It's easily assimilated. The best answer is to look at animals that eat grass and see how large and powerful they are, right? The the ox or the cow or the buffalo, right? And I mean, there's a lot there from a physical perspective. The intestine, we have large intestines, not small ones. We need to digest. We don't have canines. We don't have biologically. We are evolved to eat more plant-based, right? From a protein perspective, you will get the protein if you are planning it right. And like I said, if you're not eating, I think deficient diets are diets that are focused on junk food, processed food. So if you eat wholesome, whole foods, nutritious, raw, and a variety of foods, you will get the protein and everything you need. By that account, all of our ancestors would have been severely deficient.
Hmm.
For example, ancient India or Vedic traditions or lifestyles where plant-based food was the dominant. So,
I don't want to even put you in a spot where you have to comment on something that is about nutritious value, right? That is not the point of this topic. What I do want to know about is a discussion on how plant-based diets can also be case in point being India last year pushed for 2 years back now, pushed for a millet heavy diet as well as millets being extremely climate friendly.
yeah,
So, along with UN, India had this entire year dedicated to the year of millets.
yeah,
I do want to bring that up because I
yeah.
personally really believe in the power of millets as a climate friendly solution. Um, so are there any hidden climate gems like that that you know of, probably that people should know of?
Well, I think millets is actually a great example. And, I'm not, I think just from the perspective of policy, this is a great decision to say, let's go back to millets. And this is a great decision also because of monocultures, because, although wheat and rice are fine, we do have a monoculture problem. We are just producing the same variety cultivar of wheat and rice. And for a country that had over 200 varieties of rice at one point, rice that could survive floods, all kinds of things. We now have a very low quantity. So if we say, let's go back to traditional foods and say those are millets, that's great because they're also packed with nutrition. So you do
Mm.
have, I mean, and if you talk about protein, like a half a cup of or a quarter cup, I think, of dry millets is about 5.5 grams of protein or something
Oh,
of that
wow.
sort.
Mhm.
So that's, yeah. So I think protein is also about combining foods. When you combine foods, you get, yeah, enough. So there you have all of your fiber, your vitamins, minerals, micronutrients, all amino acids. Everything is there. No one food has everything. It's a combination of food. So millets would
Mm.
have something, then you add your lentils, you add your veggies. And similarly in India, I think we have so many greens that we've simply forgot, like amaranth leaves, for example.
Yeah.
Uh, just not going away from the regular just spinach, let's say, or lettuce. And I'm surprised at how popular lettuce becomes, in urban India, where
Yeah.
you have tons and tons of greens.
In fact, it's even seasonal to a point where this month belongs to this leafy veggie, is how at least my mom will cook
Yeah.
according to what season we're in, and she will not buy some veggies just because she's insistent that that doesn't grow right now. So probably it has been forcefully grown on the farm, so you shouldn't eat it.
I mean, in Punjab, you would have sarson ka saag, huh? So you'd
Yes.
have mustard greens, you have fenugreek leaves, you have, I don't know, greens from almost every. So that's also ensuring the plant is fully used, it's not
Mm.
wasted. And they are, so that's a hidden gem. And I say this as someone living in Europe, where I miss those greens
Yeah.
because you get a certain, of course you get good stuff, it's not a problem, but look at the value that drumstick leaves brings, for example, along with the drumstick and the moringa, now that's all these are popular health foods,
Superfoods.
yeah, that have been twisted and turned into powders and pills for us, but
Yeah.
actually they're just there. That's the value of just, eating what's in season, what's local, what's there. And the problem is if we don't demand it, farmers will stop producing it. And I noticed this trend. Farmers don't produce, in my childhood, there were many more greens around in Indian markets than today, often.
Absolutely. In fact, I worked on a project 2 years back, which was related to millets again. We tried to understand how the millet ecosystem in Madhya Pradesh, where they grow something called
Yeah,
kodo and kutki, has almost but disappeared over years because even the locals there, the younger population,
yeah,
has an aspirational value because of the emphasis on wheat and rice, and they don't want to produce or eat the same old millets, as you say, but
yeah,
they are so nutritionally sort of rich for that landscape as well as very drought resistant.
yeah,
So there are new ways now to help farmers continue growing them rather than move away to more water intensive crops.
yeah.
Another topic when it comes to food and climate change or even environment becomes the food wastage issue, right? Because there are so many studies that show how 1/3 of global emissions actually come from food wastage. Um, so what is a way? What is a way out of it? I know it's a complex issue and it's not a one word or one sentence answer, but are there any proven solutions that actually help um, reduce this?
Yeah. Yeah, I think food waste it's critical. Also, the Lancet report mentions it. You're right. It's a very big component. And again, I think as we've moved into eating more packaged food, we have the problem of plenty in some places, and in some places there is very little to go around. So I think awareness, building a consciousness of what happens when you just throw away food is important. And I think this is important also for children. I know it sounds a bit preachy perhaps, but the fact is that so many people go hungry. And, when we build that consciousness and say, okay, so do that this food that went into your waste bin today was actually the size of a meal and it could have been used to feed some other children or so on. It this is necessary to have that awareness and then to change our behavior accordingly.
Mhm.
I mean, in households, it's got to be a household practice. Food waste is not something that you just do individually. It's about the practices you follow as a household, the practices you follow as a community, also for recycling, the practices you follow in a policy sense. So in a household, say cooking smaller portions, right? Buying in bulk, reducing packaging, ordering less of ordering out, more of cooking at home. And if raw food is left over, so again, composting, that's a big thing. So if you could contribute to composting in your community, or you have your own little garden. So I think things like that, people can start to do things like that. We do need kind of social norms to
Mhm.
nudge people. So we also need this to be at a bigger level, to avoid wastage. And I think wastage more than individually. I don't have the data on this, but it's about restaurants. It's about a lot of events and
Absolutely.
hospitality industry. So that's where food waste really needs to be cut, and that requires, yeah, big shift in policy and regulations. We do need regulations for that.
Okay, I think moving on to a little lighter note on this conversation. Um, Radhika, if you had a magic wand and you were given power that any policy that you would like to make will happen, what is that one thing you will choose in terms of food and its connection with climate?
I would basically make plant-based the default in your bigger functions, as a policy default, right? So every time you have these events or conferences, functions, any gathering of people, at least there, because there you do not have to think about what someone's choice is. You're anyway presenting them with food that is, that is offered to them. So if that could be by default plant-based, we are avoiding so much of, so many emissions. We're avoiding wastage. We are naturally gravitating towards a lower emission diet. And now there are studies, we find that also on menus, for example, if you put in plant-based foods, but you don't label them as such. So you,
Mm.
again, I think labeling creates a certain segregation, a certain categorization, which can be daunting for people, or, people who have strong opinions that I do this or I don't do this. Whereas if you just present that, that's what you eat, I mean, and this is also how we grew up. Your mother put food in front of you. This is the food that you eat, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but anyway, there are studies about menus. So if menus have plant-based options, but they don't label them, the restaurant goers automatically choose those options by default. Not that they don't have animal foods, but they do not label something as vegan or not, So that makes a difference. So people automatically choose the option that's plant-based.
This is interesting. And you say there are studies that show this because when I that just made me think of another controversy that had just popped up in India recently on the issue of pure veg restaurants. Now,
Mhm.
again, if you look at it from the other end, right? What you say makes sense because when you label something as pure veg, you're immediately putting up a moral sort of perspective on the other end. So instead of just labeling that, if you just don't do that, maybe both sides have a common denominator.
Yeah, because then we're putting it in the public sphere, and
Yeah.
every culture has concepts around purity and impurity, not only related to food, but to every aspect of life. So, alcohol, for example, is used as a disinfectant in certain cultures, and it's considered impure in certain. Yeah, so there are all of these norms that we have in society. So I think we need to bypass them in some ways for a climate friendly future rather than getting into the controversies. I mean,
Mm,
you also have controversies around plant-based meat, for example.
absolutely.
There's yeah.
Well, speaking of future of food, that is where I anyways wanted to lead the conversation. There are so many new things coming up, like fake meat or
Yeah.
so to say plant-based meat, lab-grown meat, the Beyond Meat burgers that you keep hearing about. What is your opinion on this, and how does it relate to the sustainable choices that we all are trying to make?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked this because I think there's recent news that some people in Texas, is it, have just protested against lab-grown meat.
Aha.
I may be mistaken. I would have to look it up, but where exactly is it? But somewhere in the US. And I read an article recently on how the French are so attached to their dairy, right? That they
Hmm.
cannot imagine a croissant that is dairy-free or butter-free. And
Right.
bakers are subverting that by not labeling it as dairy-free or vegan, but they're creating flaky, creamy, buttery, whatever, vegan croissants and trying to subvert the norm. So it's interesting.
It's
So these
blasphemy.
blasphemy for the French, for sure. And that's what I mean. There are so many cultural norms that, people would say, this is just unacceptable to me. So I
Mm,
have to therefore not do it. But if you're looking at the climate angle, and I see a lot of shift in youngsters at least in Europe, there's a lot of
mm,
climate consciousness now in terms of food. Um, I do see that people are trying to make more sustainable choices. And I think what we need to remember is that these controversies sometimes treat, say, plant-based meat as the only food that you will eat. In effect, in reality, plant-based meat, the products made from it have much lower carbon emission than a regular meat burger, right? But would you eat a burger every day? So for me, this is the way of looking at it to say that if you're going to eat a burger, go ahead and have a plant-based burger. It fulfills your craving, right? It is still processed food. So I'm not saying it's necessarily health food for
mm,
sure. But then so many of these things are not health foods, and you wouldn't be eating them every day. So if the balance has to be about which is emission friendly, then it's a plant-based burger. And it's not your everyday food. So I think we don't need the debate on whether how terrible it is or how good it isn't from a health perspective, because your
Right.
regular burger is not good from a health perspective either. So that's yeah.
Yeah, I think it's always nice to have an option so
Yeah.
that people, if they want to choose something,
Yeah.
either more environmental or just for their own dietary restrictions, want to choose that. Either
Yeah.
way, having an option, I personally think that's a good idea. Now, whether or not people want to protest on these is everyone has a right to protest. There's a also we don't know the implications of what happens here onwards. Um,
So I just want to add to that, because we're living in an evolving society, and technology is part of our lives, whether we like it or not. So we do need technological innovation, farming innovation, agriculture innovation to drive the way forward. It is one part of the puzzle, right? It's not the whole puzzle. It's not the solution or the be all to everything. A lot of things is what we as humans need to do, but for sure this could be one part of it.
yeah.
And I look at it from that angle, it is sufficient. It doesn't have to take up that much space in my opinion.
Yeah. A personal story on that front is one of the most controversial food choices that I have made, according to my parents and some friends, was in Denmark. There was an event where they were talking about future of food, and obviously plant-based regenerative food practices was the highlight and the theme. There was one
Mhm.
stall where they had put up dried worms.
Yeah.
These were worms I had fed on compost out of the local community gardens. And their claim, which was completely scientific, was that these can make for extremely great sources of protein because they actually feed on compost. So you're not investing anything new to add to the emissions. They are highly protein packed, protein rich sources. I did try them, and honestly, it wasn't so bad. I might get boycotted for saying all of this, but it wasn't so bad. And if such options present themselves without
Yeah.
the label of it being worm, maybe a powdered form or something, I actually can see myself adding it as a supplement or as a protein powder instead of a whey-based protein.
We do consume, people who love chocolate. I don't know if they know, but there is the shell of a beetle used at times
Okay.
for, yeah, for making it. And so you do have insects in your food chain. Somehow they're just there, right? So we just don't know it, but it's
Yeah.
there.
The
So
labeling, circling back to your point, the labeling is what actually deters our mind or fosters the connection.
yeah.
Um, on a hopeful note, I think that's always what I try to end each episode on, because otherwise it's a scary world out there. But what gives you optimism about the future of food production, its relationship with climate change, as well as health?
Yeah. Before the hope, I want to say that the impacts of climate change on food systems can be devastating, right? And we do need to recognize that. We need to recognize that climate change will directly impact, say, soil fertility, the rain patterns, and therefore the crop yields, right? And our nutrition, the nutrition composition in the food. There will be huge, pest management will be a problem, for example. So
Mhm.
drought, all of that is there. So we need to know that this is true, and it's likely in the near future as we go ahead, and we already see it. But we can still be hopeful, because we have the capacity to make a decision. As humans, we have thinking beings, and we do have options, and the options are really, they may seem radical, but they are the options that are actually the best for the planet and for your health. So that's the double whammy, which I think we forget, that what we do for the planet, what is good for the environment, for nature, is automatically good for our health.
Hmm.
And it does mean challenging some preconceived notions. So, first is looking at the region, and I'm looking at some material that has been put out, right? So the World Economic Forum. So now all of these, the FAO, the World Economic Forum, we have literature that supports the kind of steps we need to take. One is about regenerative power of the earth, of the soil, right? So practicing regenerative agriculture, for high nutrient food, for healthy soil, and for supporting the land to keep feeding us for generations to come. Again, building local and circular food systems. So there's so much circularity that is automatically there in nature. We just need to harness it. We need to have businesses, agribusinesses that are circular. They will help provide jobs. So we don't have to think in these absolutes that if we cut
Yeah.
out an industry, it means that jobs will just end or people will be unemployed. No, you recreate a different business environment. You create circular environments, right? You reduce the dependency on imports for countries so they can sustain themselves the best way possible. We
Right.
increase composting, we increase organic farming in a way that is sustainable and economically viable, right? We allow farmers to be the main voice, to be the leading voice, to support them to build this kind of regenerative discussion, be part of the policy discussion. We're seeing this. Farmer protests are everywhere, but I am noticing a lack of actual engagement, right? And I'm not saying that the farmers are the ones who are absolutely right, because we also need to be aware of inequities within the farming system. Some
Mm.
farmers are rich and some are poor. So whose voice is heard where? But that's okay, that's another topic. But then if we allow for farmers to have a voice and to work together to create better policy solutions and to allow them to drive these solutions, right? Again, thinking about hunger, because food is intersectional. It's about local some people have more and some people have nothing. So again, what is the true cost of food? So moving to what again, eliminating the middle men, or the middle aspect, but thinking about how the current price of food can be improved for
Mm.
everyone, affordable, accessible, right? And thinking about the health impact. So if we have poor food that is being pushed out at us, right? It's unhealthy. So there's a health impact. All economies and countries will bear the burden of a huge health burden if people fall sick by eating
Yeah.
food. And we need a collaboration. So we need like a radical way of thinking. This is not going to be business as usual. We do need to work together with farmers, consumers, funders, governments, NGOs, businesses, and think about kind of changing the mindset and the approach to food.
Absolutely. What you mentioned made me think of one point of losing out on some food that used to be there until the last generation, until our parents' generation, that we may or may not get to see again. There are so many biodiversity losses that have been mapped out, especially in India, because you mentioned earlier there were so many varieties of rice. Now we probably only know four or five of them. Similarly, on multiple different levels of the food system. So I guess seed banks
Yes.
conserving and demanding for some old food products that we haven't heard of, or if it's a new veggie wanting to try it out, could also drive demand.
Yeah, I think there's a trend there. I mean, and what you're talking about is so important. Seed banks. I've worked with Vandana Shiva briefly, or met her sometimes, and she's a pioneer because she has all these seed banks there. And there are other people we've seen. I think there was an award given to a lady from a tribal area who
Yes.
has kept seeds. So these are the keepers of tradition and of our society. They're actually, we need so much more of this. So first, we need an incentive to allow these people, to allow seed banks to flourish. And if you look at narratives, it's always about what's trendy. So I noticed this in my own research, where I found that the media talks about, they talked about plant-based food or climate-friendly food practices in the most disdainful manner in, say, 2010,
Mm.
versus basically dismissing it. That was a media narrative in global media. And then in fast forward 10, 15 years, in say 2018 or 19, I noticed that the media started to talk about food in more glamorous ways. So what is trendy? Because it suits also businesses. So suddenly the lentil or the pulse or the chickpea becomes this trendy star, and you see it in chips, you see it in popcorn, you see it, I don't know, in ice cream, anything.
Yeah.
And you know, this is interesting, but this is short term. I think
Mm.
because then it's still following a business case. But the narrative, it does shift the narrative to a certain extent. And so your idea of talking about a food that is lost, and it can be
Mm.
revived and reinvented and then presented in a fascinating new way is a good one. But I think we need to balance also the risk of it becoming,
A
the
superfood.
spirulina or the avocado or the superfood. Yeah, because then you put pressure on farmers to produce it as a cash crop. We've seen this
Right.
with that, from coffee to cocoa to
Right. From bananas,
yes.
the
So we
classic
need to
Banana Republic case.
exactly. So we need a much more balanced approach to saying food is, yeah, what food is good for you? What are the ancient foods? And terroir is again important. Land, soil, where you grew up, what is the climate? We eat as per the climate as well,
Mm.
right? So perhaps a certain food that's great for you in a warm country like India may not be the best bet in Finland or Iceland, for
Mhm.
example.
Mhm.
So yeah, so there's not a one answer or a one solution that fits all, but for sure, if we have seed banks in every part of the world, then every part of the world will have diverse foods. And if we still live in a global world and we still travel, you could go and sample diverse foods, right?
This was such a nice discussion. Thank you so much for your input. And I want to delve deeper into this. So at some point, I'm going to ask you to come back and give us more insights on the other side of food systems that we haven't really touched upon. Uh, but until then, I think this is a great starting episode for anyone interested in what we eat, how it comes to us, what are the costs of it, and what are the implications, along with some of the easy solutions at our fingertips, literally. So, yeah, thank you so much, Radhika, and have a nice day.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Sanika. It was wonderful. And of course, I just want to again end by saying I'm not the specialist or the expert, but I think a lot of things are out there and we could make those changes, as you said. So, yeah. So, thanks. This was lovely to talk to you.
Thank you for watching this episode. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We're also available on other social media. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. See you around for the next episodes.